This month at Manor Park Classics, and as an entry to our December auction, we are privileged to be in the presence of this Riley 472, the top model in BMC's Finina Saloon range that sat at the top of their four-cylinder cars at the end of the 1950s and through the majority of the 1960s. And today, while it is blisteringly cold out here, around -2 degrees, I'd like to take you on a little bit of a story time, really. Talk a little bit about BMC, the British Motor Corporation, a little bit about Riley and where they sat in that tree, and also some parallels between the British motor industry of the 1950s and also the modern motor industry. We will then have a look at this car's styling, we'll look at its engineering and a few of its features, its gorgeous interior as well, and also where it kind of sat in the wider market in this kind of time period at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, and then of course we will go for a little drive as well. But as I mentioned, this is the top model of BMC's Finina Saloon range. Launched in 1958, and this Riley came along a year later in 1959. So as part of this range of cars, I think we have 5 different cars to go through. We have the Austin Cambridge and the Morris Oxford. We have the MG Magnet. We have the Riley 1660, earlier 1560, and this Riley 472, or earlier the 468, before the car was slightly revised in 1961. And BMC itself, of course, doesn't exist today, and to be fair, it hasn't existed since about 1968, there or thereabouts. But BMC first came about, of course, the British Motor Corporation in 1952, after 2 of Britain's industrial giants, Austin and Morris, merged together. And in doing so, each of them brought together a raft of other marques and coach builders and extra posher versions of their cars, which all eventually had to come together into one competent model line, shall we say. So through the 1950s, we have a few Austin and Morris cars that are competing with one another. Now this is completely natural, as of course the companies had only just merged and many of these cars predated that merger. So we have at the bottom of the range the likes of the Austin A30, later the A35, and the Morris Minor. Then moving up a little bit, we have the likes of the Austin A40, and then on the slightly posher side, we have a few years later, I think 1957 these cars were launched, the Wolseley 1500 and the Riley 1.5. And so that brings us wider from just Austin and Morris towards Riley and Wolseley as well. So Austin and Morris were your 2 mainstream marques. They were like your Ford or Vauxhall of today. And then we have MG, who of course everybody knows, producing more sports-facing examples. We then have Wolseley, who produced more luxury-facing models, and then finally Riley at the top of the tree, at least in terms of these Finina Saloons, who produced, yes, luxury-facing cars, but also sporting as well. They really towed that line, and of course, as a result, sat at the very top of the pile. There's also Van den Plas, of course, and yes, the S at the end should be pronounced because Van den Plas is a Flemish family name. It's not French, and so the S is not silent, even if BMC, later British Leyland, did occasionally leave the S off and pronounce it as Van den Plas. Anyway, there was not a Van den Plas version of these cars, so we have those 5 models through which to work through: Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley and Riley. And so they all sit in different parts of the tree. And so if you wanted a higher spec car, you went and you bought an MG or a Wolseley, or maybe of course even a Riley. And so a quick parallel this draws with the modern motor industry is that this was the birth of BMC badge engineering. So before this point, BMC was yet to launch a really unified car across Austin and Morris that was a true collaboration between the 2. This was really the first car launched in 1958 and the first to be badge engineered in such a wide manner. And to many of us, including I think the way these cars go down in history, the badge engineering exercise sounds like a bit of an extravagance and also a bit of a confusion. It would maybe push people away and would maybe alienate people from identifying with the car they bought, for the BMC badge doesn't actually sit anywhere on any of these cars unless there is a little sticker in the back window, as this one has. But instead of viewing these cars as separate cars that should not be compared, instead view them as trim levels. So if you went in and bought the most basic example, your poverty spec Finina Saloon, you would have come away with either an Austin or a Morris. Depending on which dealer you went to buy it from, which dealer was in your town, whether they sold Austins or Morrises. Then a step up the range, what 20, 30 years later would be, you know, an L or a GL trim level would be your MG or your Wolseley. And then of course at the top of the pile, again, for the 15th time, is this Riley 472. So I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at this. You know, BMC, later British Leyland, are so well known for their badge engineering madness, and in many ways it is madness. But also, if you look at it from a different perspective, as long as people are aware of these cars and what they're meant to be, they are trim levels, really. We can also compare this to the more modern motor industry with how a lot of manufacturers operate today. So, in effect, the Volkswagen Group is a little bit like this, albeit with a slightly greater distinction. So instead of buying a Volkswagen Golf, you could have an Audi A3, or maybe you could have a Skoda Octavia, which of course is a little bit larger, or Skoda Rapid maybe would be a fairer distinction. You could have a Seat Leon, for example. All these different cars that are all essentially the same underneath, sitting in slightly different market niches just to pick their buyers where necessary. That is a little bit how BMC were operating in the 1950s and in the 1960s, albeit with much less distinction. So compared to a standard Austin or Morris, this Riley looks very, very similar. It has slightly different tail fins on the back, and of course it has the famous Riley grille on the front of it, and not that much different on the outside is changed, other than you know, some little embellishments, this lovely two-tone paintwork, etc. And as for the Farina saloons in general, as the name suggests, they were styled by Pininfarina in Italy. And I love this style. I think it's such a classy, very dignified, and it is quite a staid image, yes, but I think that's very British in a sense. It's something I very much like. While by the end of the 1950s, the tail fins were maybe starting to go out of fashion a little bit, I think they suit the general lines of this car so very, very well. But of course, if we've discussed BMC, we've discussed Riley, Wolseley, MG, Austin and Morris, etc., all of which had essentially the same cars, then Pininfarina were being a little bit cheeky as well, because they sold this same essential style, not the body shell, just the styling to this car, to a raft of manufacturers. So you could buy, for example, a Peugeot or a Lancia, and a few others as well, that were all very, very similar looking to this car. I believe there was also a Fiat as well, all of which look very similar. But of course, at the end of the 1950s into the 1960s, people still generally bought cars from their own country. So seeing the likes of a Peugeot version of this style in the UK would have been very, very unusual. But the Farina saloons in general sat, as I said, at the top of BMC's four-cylinder range of cars. These were a mid-sized family car of their era, nowhere near at the top of the tree. That would be the likes of the Austin Westminster, big six-cylinder cars. But this being at the top of the four-cylinder range is the car that was, you know, very, very popular. Not as popular, of course, as their smaller cars, but was produced on a huge scale at the end of the 50s and through most of the 60s. So underneath the skin, we have a lot of very, very well-proven mechanical components. We have a live axle and leaf springs at the back, for example. Of course, the car is rear-wheel drive. And at the front, we have BMC's fantastic, incredibly long-lived B-Series engine. We just pop into the interior and pop the bonnet. Clicks nicely into place, as all these old BMC cars do, and we have that B-Series engine produced by Austin Morris, BMC, later British Leyland, of course, for so many years. Between the beginning of the 1950s, around 1954 maybe even 1951, I might be misremembering, all the way through to 1980, when of course it was last used under the bonnet of the MGB, finally in 1800cc form. So this engine was used in a huge number of cars. It was used latterly in the likes of the Marina in the Princess, and then a little bit earlier it was used in cars like the Land Crab, the Austin 1800 of course, earlier in cars like this of course, and also in the smaller, Wolseley 1500 and Riley 1.5s. This is a very, very hardy power unit, one that performs very well. Nice little overhead valve lump it is, and of course this car being a Riley, it has twin carburettors atop it, producing about 70 brake horsepower there or thereabouts, which puts it within that ladder again of the BMC trim levels, where Wolseley sat a little bit below, as well as MG, producing around 60 brake horsepower from the name. So that's how we get the names of these cars. So this car first started out as the Riley 468 and later as the 472, indicating its cylinder, not its cylinder capacity, sorry, its cylinder number, 4 cylinders, and of course its power level. The Wolseley versions were much the same, earlier being a 1560 and later a 1660. That little bit less power, and of course they indicate the engine capacity. Early cars with 1.5 litre engines, this later car with 1.6 litres. So now we've spent a couple of minutes looking around this car, walking around it, talking about its general historiography. Let's get inside and have a little look at the interior before we go for our drive. As we step inside the opulence of our Riley here, I just want to bring your attention to that door thunk. In fact, we'll do it again here as well. And there is a little bit of tinniness there, but I want to bring up something about British cars of the 1950s, which I really like, and that's their perceived quality being so much higher than anyone remembers them being. They are built in a very classical way. They're built using very good grade steel in this kind of era that declined later down the line, but these 50s design cars still feel so solid. Everything has a weight to it in this car, which I really, really like. And I think that brings us on to what I would view maybe as the biggest competitor for the likes of the Riley and the Wolseley versions of these cars, especially the Riley version, and that's the Humber Sceptre. Now, Humber, of course, was owned by the Roots Group, and again, they used very similar cars to do different things. So like BMC had Austin and Morris, for example, and then Wolseley, Riley, MG, etc. Roots had instead Hillman being their mainstream mark. And then they had, of course, Humber, which was very luxurious, the kind of car used by governments, indeed prime ministers for many years before they switched to Rovers in the 1960s, were driven around in the likes of a Humber Imperial, shall we say. But you also had marks within there like Singer, for example. So all these different niches are filled by different companies in different ways, but they're all generally doing the same thing. So BMC's approach was not at all unusual. But I think this car's biggest competitor, as I mentioned, was the Humber Sceptre, which I believe was a little bit smaller than the Finina Saloons, though I'm happy to be corrected on that. But they were quite a chunk more powerful, and they were more expensive as a result. So in buying a Riley 468 or 472, like this car is in period, it was quite a discerning choice to not spend that extra money on a Humber and instead support BMC instead. But I think the design is lovely. Maybe BMC cars are not built with quite as thick steel as Roots Group cars, but I'm a BMC man at heart. I like my Austins and Morrises, etc. And the interior of this thing is fantastic. We have a lovely wood finish across the dashboard. We have a nice integration for a radio as well. Remember, this is 1958 we're talking about, and they were thinking about these things. We have a speaker grille down here that's very, very traditional. It is so luxurious in its general design. And of course, though this is a Riley with the equipment, with the trim to match, just think about how this felt in the likes of an Austin, for example. It feels like your front room, and I like that very much. We have these rotary knobs for the heat and for the fan, etc. And in front of us, we have all these different dials showing us everything we could possibly want to know, including oil pressure and our amperage. But this being the Riley version, it is the only Finina Saloon car to come standard with a rev counter, with a tachometer, which I think is very, very nice. And this interior is in lovely condition. I love the beige trim, and I love the colour scheme on the outside as well. And I'd just like to draw your attention to something that I've noticed in this glove box. I'm not going to open this little tiny jar, but within it is a very aged Esso lubrication service sticker that I presume will have maybe been inside the engine bay or maybe tucked somewhere in the interior many, many years ago. And it says, "Important, when your speedo next reads 4,000 283 miles, your car will be ready for service again. Nice Gill Sans font as well on that. But considering this car now reads 26,900 miles, I think this was some from many, many years ago. Certainly it looks it. But an indicated 26,000 miles is just remarkable for a car well over 60 years of age now. It is a lovely, lovely thing. So I will get that camera put up on a suction mount on the inside of the window, and then we'll go for a little drive as well. So I have opted to remove my coat because it's a little bit less bulky, but just for an idea of how cold it is today, I'm wearing 2 pairs of socks and these boots, and I can't feel my toes. So it is quite cold today. Of course, we've pulled this Riley out of the shed, but it's not started on that, so it is still cold. And with a little bit of choke, that just starts beautifully. Could have used maybe a little bit more choke just to start it, but hey, there we are. Our gauges all come to life. We're discharging a little bit now because we're idling, but if we apply a few revs, we get some lovely amps coming up. We've got a quarter of a tank of fuel as well, which is nice. Most of these cars come to us with no fuel in them, as you might expect. But our oil pressure is nice. That's around 70 pounds per square inch. And for those of you who talk in black and white, our water temperature is around 90 Fs. I don't know what that is in Celsius, if I'm quite honest. Let's change our heater just to defrost a little bit, just so we don't end up too... In fact, you know what? Let's open our quarter light window. How cool is that? Let's go for a little drive. So I've never driven one of these cars before. Ensure the handbrake is actually off. Oh, it's like playing roulette with the traffic round here today. Trucks all getting in the way, etc. But I have never driven one of these cars before. I've never driven a Finina Saloon. I've driven a little Wolseley 1500, a car I've mentioned a couple of times in this video already, which is very much this car's little brother, though of course the Riley version, the 1.5, will have had a little bit more power. So we're sat here with our lovely B-Series engine, and power unit again that I have a bit of experience with. Let's just close that window, just keep a little bit of the warmth in the car today. But as you can tell, if we just go down to 3rd gear, this car runs really, really nicely. Over 60 years old, of course, this car will be, and yeah, it feels a bonny little thing. And of course we have our lovely blinking indicator stalk on the right hand side, and a very, very snickety little gear change. 4-speed gearbox change on the floor, of course. And we have that B-Series engine, which of course just burbles very, very nicely. Of course, it feels very much like an MGB power unit, because that's what it is really, albeit in lower capacity. But of course, we have those twin carburetors and around 70 brake horsepower, which was an awful lot in the early 1960s. Maybe not as much as a Humber Scepter, but certainly enough to get us traveling. So we're, you know, just bobbing around these lanes here very, very nicely indeed. What a lovely little car this is. So we're getting a little bit of temperature through her now. We're up to about 170 Fs. Again, whatever that means in Celsius, I don't know. But in spite of the no power steering, of course, this big steering wheel helps compensate. And the visibility out of this car is just wonderful. We put our foot down a little bit and we really get shifting. Proper wing mounted mirrors, of course. So my line of sight is fantastic for what's around me. And you can see the edges of the wings as well at the front, which makes it so easy to place on the roads. Of course, this is a mid-sized family saloon, if not maybe even a large family saloon in this era, but it feels so compact and so easy to place today. And despite the fact that we have this huge steering wheel and very simple mechanical components, this car feels so alive. And all the inputs are so direct and so immediate that it's so easy just to rev match up and down the box. And to just nip these gears in, such a lovely gearbox. And of course the brake pedal has so much feel in it as well. Of course no brake servo on this car, so we get a lovely, lovely pedal feel. And as we come round, just these roundabouts here really, we can place the car so easily, and then also feel just the car dance a little bit on the way out. Maybe if we were in second gear that time, it would have done it a little bit more, but you can just feel the car get towards its edge of grip. It's very, very intuitive, and there's no wonder that so many brilliant racing drivers came out of Great Britain in this kind of era, when the kind of cars that were on offer to normal people like you and me were of such a controllable quality. You know, that's not to say that this is the last word in refinement or in ability, but there is a level of control and delicacy you can have with this era of British cars that is absolutely wonderful. In fact, having said that, it's just brought me back to, I can't remember, it might have been a fifth gear feature 20 odd years ago, and it was Tiffany Dell, who was one of my favourite car television presenters of all time. I think Tiffany Dell and Alan de Cadenet are two of my heroes in this kind of genre. And Tiffany Dell was talking about how the single car you need to be able to learn car control properly at normal road speeds, to learn how a car acts when it gets towards the edge, you need to drive a Morris Minor. And this is, for many years, in fact for its entire life, for the Minor was built either side of 1959 for the Wolseley and 1969 again for the Wolseley. The Morris Minor was one of this car's little brothers, and so there's a lot shared with this. Indeed, the engine architecture, though this one is B series, the Morris Minor is an A series, very similar in many ways. So this is something that I feel if I wasn't doing huge motorway journeys, I could drive every day. It's such a lovely, lovely little car to drive. So now we're settled into a cruising speed on these roads here. We're doing about 2,300 RPM. And we also get that lovely gearbox whine in first, second and third gears. I assume that means therefore that they are straight cut gears. I'm very used to straight cut first gear, at least on British cars. Certainly the likes of the Mini has a straight cut first gear, and I own a couple of Metros. But bringing us to the Mini brings us to why this car is quite important in the wider historical context, because these cars launched in 1958 or 1959 for the Wolseley version, originally the 468 and later this slightly more powerful 1600cc 472. But only a year later, in 1959, BMC launched the Mini, which had the smaller A-series engine, of course, but it had front-wheel drive and it had independent suspension. It was a two-box shape as well. Of course, revolutionised the motor industry. We will not labour upon the Mini. But after the Mini came the likes of the 1100 and the 1800, both of which were absolute technical tour de forces. They were so modern. Little rev match down into second, just to make it a little bit easier on the engine and gearbox. But those cars being so modern meant that this was really the last classic leaf-sprung rear drive BMC car. So it was a point in history, a really important point in history of the changing of the automotive guard, really. While of course the likes of Ford continue to use live axles and leaf springs for their rear suspension for a number of years to come, a number of decades to come, for BMC and for the wider motor industry, this car was just on the climax of history as cars started to really change into their modern form. So as for a real classic, very elegant, very classy, traditional rear-driven, very simple car, this is really the end of the road. And that's a bit of a shame in many ways, but it also puts this car in a much more important place than I think many people realise. And driving it here, it's a wonderful experience. I'm very privileged to get to do this kind of thing. But what a bonny little car it is. So if you are interested in this thing, then please do head over to our website. We've got loads of photographs of it. We have a write-up on it as well. And if you do like the look of it, then please come and have a look for yourself. Come and see it in person ahead of our December auction.